Hello, my name is Nate Gillespie, and this is a pre-recorded presentation for the 2024 virtual meeting of the Society for Mathematical Psychology. Now, I'd like to begin with a brief perceptual task with some stimuli we've been using to look at auditory memory. I'll play you 3 sounds, then I'd like you to think about what they sound like to you. Ready? Okay. Here's sound 1. Here's sound 2. And here's sound 3. Now, odds are that if I were to survey everyone that watches this video, we would see that people have different impressions of these sounds. And indeed, the word cloud shown here highlights all the different terms that 240 people used to describe sounds like the ones you just heard. And I would argue that this variation suggests that there are qualitative individual differences in perceptions for sounds like these. How can we account for such differences when studying memory in the auditory domain and beyond? And is there a way to incorporate these differences into our cognitive models? In today's talk, I'm going to present a framework for addressing how we can use individual qualitative differences in the domain of auditory perception as tools to contextualize our quantitative models of auditory memory. I'll then present a methodology for analyzing these differences at scale before finally offering some takeaways on how this approach can be used to enhance experimental design and theory building in auditory memory and other domains. So, what are some of the tools we typically use to study auditory perception and memory? Well, a popular approach is to ask people to rate how similar two sounds seem using sliding scales, setting the stage for multidimensional scaling and related analyses. Another method is to ask people to make distinctiveness ratings for individual auditory stimuli, and analogous tasks have been implemented to account for item distinctiveness in a range of domains, perhaps most notably in Nosovsky and Palmieri's exemplar-based random walk model. It's also possible to assess how well people can remember or recognize particular features of sounds that they've heard, which is an approach that lends itself to signal detection and ROC analyses. Now, these quantitative approaches provide valuable insight, to be sure, but I would argue the ways in which people conceptualize their perceptual experiences may carry a lot of additional meaning that's not fully captured by such rarefied quantitative measures. That is, we can't discuss many of the properties of an audio signal without also considering the auditory sensation in the mind of the listener. So, to better understand auditory perception, we need to qualify the ways in which listeners conceptualize the sounds that they hear. One way to do this is to simply embed open-ended text response questions within larger behavioral paradigms. So, for instance, in a series of studies I've conducted on the relationship between perceptual similarity and recognition memory, I've investigated auditory perception using a variety of standard quantitative approaches. So, specifically, I've asked people to make similarity and recognition judgments for sequential pairs of the sounds you heard, or sounds like the kind you heard at the beginning of this talk. Alongside these tasks, however, I also asked people questions about how they conceptualized the sounds that they were hearing. And here are those questions now. For the sake of time today, I'll be focusing on how I analyzed the responses to question 2. That is, the strategies people used when making their recognition judgments. So, people engaged in a standard old-new recognition memory paradigm for sequentially presented pairs of these sounds. And then immediately following that task, they were asked, what strategies did you use to make your judgments about whether the sounds you heard were old or new? And the data we gathered in response to this question comprised 240 1 to 2 sentence answers. So what tools do we have for analyzing the structure of this sort of qualitative free response data? Well, one method is content analysis, which involves manually reading each response in order to identify and compare latent themes. And if your data set is relatively small, this approach works quite well. And indeed, this was the method we applied during our first pass through the data. And here's what that analysis pipeline looked like. We had to download the text responses, clean the data, move the clean data into different templates, and so on. Then we had to have independent coders go in to read and categorize each response. And then we used those ratings to generate a master category list, noting the frequency with which each category appeared. We then narrowed down the category lists, reanalyzed the original data in light of these categories, and then calculated reliability statistics, and so on. And as you might imagine, this traditional approach to content analysis involves many steps and is quite time-consuming, requiring multiple trained coders to spend hours reading the data line by line. And in fact, analyzing the data from question 2 alone took our 4 raters around 20 hours to complete. But as with many difficult tasks in science, with enough coffee, it can be done. And the results help to illuminate the underlying themes that pervade the data set. And so what you're seeing here are the themes that each of our raters generated for the responses to question 2. And while each rater differed slightly in how they conceptualized the themes they identified, their work revealed that our participants generally reported making their recognition judgments based on things like differences in pitch, perceived roughness, and stimulus memorability. Our raters also highlighted that some people reported having no strategy, engaging with the sounds by simply focusing more on them. So, useful insights. But while content analysis can provide insight into people's responses, it's time-consuming to implement and is not feasible for larger data sets. And this raises an obvious question, which is, how can we content analyze larger data sets? For instance, when we expand the data set from question 2 to include responses to both of the other open-ended questions from our studies, we end up with nearly 1,100 responses to analyze. And while for a data set of this scale, traditional content analysis might be possible, it would take hundreds of hours to complete. An alternative method I now propose is to use computational models of semantics to extract the main topics and themes from people's responses in the same way that we might use human raters. This approach has the advantage of being able to process thousands of responses in minutes compared to the hundreds of hours it might take human raters. And one such computational approach is topic modeling. Now, this style of analysis assumes that each individual's response to a question represents a mixture of a finite number of distinct topics. In this context, a topic governs how often people use different words. The output of a topic model is the degree to which specific words are associated with specific topics, as well as the degree to which any given response is associated with those topics. Now, with that in mind, let's dive into how we applied this approach in our own data set. To make this more concrete, consider the following toy responses that people might provide when asked about their recognition strategies in our experiments. So one respondent might use words related to effort, describing how they closed their eyes and paid close attention to what they were hearing. And these words would be associated with topic 1. Another respondent might talk about attending to pitches or overtones, and these words would be associated with topic 2. Finally, a third respondent might use words that mix effort and attention to pitch, blending topics 1 and 2 in their response. So that's how topic modeling works at a high level, but there are a couple challenges we need to address before we can train a topic model to content analyze our data set. The first is determining the number of topics present in the data, and the second is deciding how to interpret topics that are very similar to one another. To address the first challenge, we applied tenfold cross-validation to find the number of topics necessary to meaningfully distinguish between the types of responses that people gave, but not so many that we were overfitting. And we did this by asking the model to determine the number of topics which minimize perplexity. This is a metric that's somewhat analogous to things like entropy, in that it represents how poorly our model can account for variation in the data. And the plot you're seeing here shows that 19 topics minimize perplexity in our dataset and was enough to capture what people said about how they determined whether a particular stimulus was old or new. The second challenge involved determining which of these 19 topics were central to how people engaged with our sounds in general, and which were a function of sampling variability. Now, in the same way that it's possible to use principal components analysis to reduce dimensions in a regression model, it's also possible to reduce these topics to a smaller set of themes that capture sets of related topics. So we applied principal components analysis, or PCA, to the output of our cross-validation procedure in order to reduce the dimensionality of the topics in our data. We then qualitatively analyzed and interpreted the resulting three-component solution based on the extent to which each of the topics loaded onto each of the components. And following this procedure, we found that three latent themes best captured the words and topics that people used to make their recognition judgments across our studies. And qualitative analyses of each of these components led us to interpret them as follows. Component 1 captured a theme of frequency or pitch comparison. Topics that loaded highly onto this component contained words related to making recognition decisions on the basis of pitches, notes, and tones. Component 2 corresponded to a theme of assigning verbal labels to timbral or textural features of each sound and using those labels to make a recognition judgment. So topics that loaded highly onto this component contained descriptive adjectives like full, rich, and warbling. Finally, component 3 highlighted a theme of focus and effort. So topics that loaded highly onto this component contained words like listen and concentrate, seeming to indicate that some people attended less to the timbral features of the sounds and more to their own perceived levels of attention. To make this a bit more concrete, I'm now showing you actual responses from our dataset. Each of these responses is characterized by one of the themes identified by our principal components analysis. So, for example, the respondent most characterized by component 1 describes the comparison of higher and lower frequencies as the driving strategy in how they made their recognition judgments. Similarly, the respondents characterized by component 2 made their judgments on the basis of how clear, muffled, or warbling the sounds were. And then finally, the respondents characterized by component 3 espoused strategies that involved increasing their concentration or making use of memory rehearsal techniques. So what does this all give us? Well, our methodology produces results that are comparable to that of a traditional content analysis, but with three distinct advantages. The first of these is clarity. So the computational nature of our approach means that every step is laid bare. Relatedly, the second advantage of this method is replicability. The results of this approach can be easily reproduced by other lab groups and so on by following the same computational procedure. And the third advantage is practicality. So instead of a few human raters spending dozens of hours identifying major themes, the present approach takes only a few hours and can be applied to sets of text data far larger than would be possible with traditional content analyses. So, for instance, we're currently applying the same method to a set of 36,000 text responses to a classic manipulation from social psychology. Also, unlike traditional content analyses, we can easily fit the output of a topic modeling procedure into a conventional data analysis pipeline. So for instance, we can correlate the presence of themes in our text data with performance metrics like D prime and so on. For instance, we find that people who scored highly on component 1, that is comparing frequency features of each sound, tended to have significantly greater self-reported auditory acuity. So I'll end there. If you'd like to learn more about this work, please do feel free to scan the QR code that you're seeing on this slide. That'll take you to the preprint on SciArchive, which details how we developed and implemented this method in a variety of contexts. I'd also like to thank the National Defense Science and Engineering Graduate Fellowship for funding this research, along with my advisor, Greg Cox, and my lab mates, Pierce and Caroline, as well as you all for your time and attention. Again, if you're interested in learning more about this work, please do feel free to scan the QR code to access the preprint, or contact me directly at ngillespie@albany.edu. Thank you again for your time.